All right, passage number 1. So I'm going to take 10 minutes. I have a timer app over here open, 10 minutes. I'm going to do this passage myself in real time. Follow along my train of thought as best as you can. But don't worry, we're going to go back after I'm done and slowly break it down step by step exactly what I did. Make sure that you have already taken this practice passage yourself, and once you're done with that, then you can go ahead and see how I approach it. Alright, excellent. Okay, so I'll do my best effort to narrate and kind of talk out loud as I'm quickly going through this in the 10 minutes. Of course, it might not be perfect, but like I said, just stick with it, see how I do it in 10 minutes, try to follow along as best as possible, and then once we're done with that 10 minutes, if it takes me that much time, then I will slow down and explain step by step what I did. Alright, here we go. 10 minutes. Alright. Okay, here we go. And play. So, looks like this passage is about externalities, voluntary transaction, taxation, regulation. Okay, so it's an econ passage. That means it's social sciences, which means that it's not super opinionated, but there's still going to be something that the author deems as important, but it's more likely going to be more descriptive. Okay, let's kind of see from the bottom here, the conclusion sentence, what it's about. In any case, taking external variables into consideration seems integral in the determination of market viability of a venture. Okay, so social sciences, they usually talk about X to Y. So that means what are we talking about? What's Y? What's X? So these variables here, so external variables are sort of important to determining market viability. So market viability would be this. External variables are over here. What the heck are external variables? What does that mean? And why are they important in determining market viability? Let's read the rest of the conclusion and then we'll keep going. So alternatively, there are such things as positive externalities as well, whereby there are unintended social benefits of a private and voluntary transaction. Okay, I don't know what that means. Subsidizing state healthcare, public transportation, or investment in education technology are always to promote behavior of private parties to incorporate social costs and benefits into their action. Okay, so it looks as though it's to promote behavior. So these things promote the behavior of private parties to incorporate social costs, right, into their actions. So again, taking external variables into consideration. That seems to be something like social costs and benefits. Are those the external variables that we're looking for? Perhaps. Okay. So let's take a quick moment here, just recap what's the main point. Apparently the author thinks that external variables like social costs and benefits are important to consider when you're determining whether or not something is viable in the market. Excellent. So let's just get a quick layout about the layout of the passage. So we have 5 paragraphs here. Where's that first shift in tone? So let's see. So taxation is a commonly discussed option. Okay, so commonly discussed meaning that this is probably where the context is. Government regulation are often debated. Again, and then this negative externality occurs. Well, that seems more like contextual and contextual. So it looks as though the layout of the passage, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The first shift in tone is probably around somewhere in paragraph 4. Looks like it. That means that we have a whole lot of context over here, and then we have some evidence and the conclusion over here. All right. So how many we have left? We have about 3 minutes. We have 3 minutes we've taken. Obviously, I'm pretty slow because I'm talking my way through this, but I'm doing my best. So let's go ahead and try and read from top to bottom and see if we can validate what we just predicted. On the surface, a transaction between two parties is meant to only involve those two parties and their interests. Okay, that's definitely not what the author thinks is a good thing. because it says on the surface. So an issue arises, here we go, an issue arises when the transaction between two parties has consequences on a third party. Here we go. So that's basically, I was wrong already. The first shift in tone is not in paragraph 4. It's almost in the second sentence. So that was wrong. Excellent. So we know that an issue, so the author thinks it's an issue when the transaction between two parties has consequences on a third party. All right. So for example, when a consumer goes to the grocer to buy a bag of chips, the grocer voluntarily exchanges the bag of chips for 99 cents to the consumer. They then walk into a bus, sit down, open and consume a bag of chips. To the neighbors, a bunch of uncomfortable sounds, potent smells, and the crumbs on the seat cushions cause unintended negative consequence. In the initial transaction, the discomfort of the neighboring passengers was not taken into consideration, leading to what is known as a negative externality. Got it. And this occurs when production or consumption imposes greater social costs than voluntary private costs. Industrial waste, collapsing fish stocks, noise pollution, they're all production-related means of generating this social cost. Consumption-related externalities can come in the form of spillover costs, rising level of obesity, particulates, litter. Not taking these externalities into consideration could lead to market failure, right? So could lead to market failure. Again, the idea of X to Y. So not taking the external variables into consideration could lead to market failure, just like taking the external variables into consideration could lead to market viability. So it's sort of the same relationship that we've already determined so far. Therefore, here we go. So therefore, that's a very conclusive word. The minimum variables necessary when discussing true market viability include not only private costs and benefits, but that's a nice shift in tone right there, social costs and benefits, and social benefits as well. Okay, so that basically, again, sort of confirms what we had already predicted that was the thesis in the concluding sentence here. Now the rest of this is going to be just more proof and discussion, and I only have 4 minutes left here, but I'll keep going. Government regulation of negative externalities are often debated. When a producer utilizes unsustainable materials, negative consequence can come in the form of waste and landfills. Taxation is also commonly discussed. By taxing the producers, they would be disincentivized to seek cheaper options, thus contributing to waste. Likewise, the producer will be motivated to create innovative solutions to the social costs being regulated. Yet, here's another shift in tone. As we, first person, have learned, there are unintended consequences of economic action. So that's another main part of the author's sort of thesis here. This principle does not only apply to producers and consumers, but, another shift in tone, also to the government. Increasing regulation to pressure producers to reduce social costs might result not only in price increases on the consumer, but also to government failure due to the high administrative cost of regulation, especially if the tax is not calculated, especially, that's a really important emphasis, if it's not calculated to include all of the appropriate values. So again, the idea of including all the appropriate values is really important to the author. So even if the price increases do not affect consumer demand, the high cost could become an unforeseen negative externality as well. So it seems as though, again, that the main thing has to do with taking into consideration social costs and social benefits, taking into consideration the consequences that transactions have on third parties, taking into consideration these external variables when determining the market viability of a venture. Excellent. Okay, so let's go ahead and answer these 5 questions. I have 2.5 minutes left. Let's keep going here. Let's see. Yep, 2.5 minutes. So what is the main conclusion of the passage? I just said it. So it has to do with taking these variables into consideration is really important when determining whether or not a market venture or a transaction is good, for example. So let's look at A versus B. Taxation would not be a prudent solution to negative externalities because of a risk for government failure. That's not really talking about taking into consideration the external variables, because I mean, kind of it does, but the main conclusion is not really about taxation as a solution. So this is okay, but the taxation part is not really necessarily that okay. I'm gonna try and hurry up here and kind of reduce how much I'm explaining, but I'm gonna go ahead and say that A is weak. Let's see B first. Calculation of market viability should incorporate negative and positive externalities. That sounds better than A, so A is gone. B versus C. Production facilities that use unsustainable. Nope, that's not good. So C's gone. B versus D. Subsidizing unintended social benefits is a lower risk option than, again, so B is good. Which of the following claims would be best improved by the use of additional support? So which claim needs more support? Solutions to negative externalities are complicated and require case-by-case analysis. That was the whole passage, so that's pretty weak. Increasing regulation to pressure producers to reduce social costs might result in government failure, and they say that that's due to high administrative costs, especially blah blah blah. So that has some support, but I'll cross off A. Subsidizing state health care are all ways to promote behavior to incorporate that. Yeah, that was not really that spoken about in detail, so I'm going to cross off B. And then D says a negative externality occurs when production or consumption imposes greater social cost, and again that has a lot of support, so C seems pretty weak. What is the attitude of the author toward government regulation of these negative externalities? Through taxation, again, it wasn't one way or another. It was pretty much a sort of neutral, maybe cautious is pretty good, so not supportive, not optimistic, and not antagonistic, so cautious. Which of the following claims is least supported by the passage? Let's look at A versus B. So admin costs are important variables to measure to prevent government failure. That's not bad. Excluding social costs when determining let's see, it looks like I ran out of time. Let's keep going, finishing it up. 2 more problems. Excluding social costs when determining market viability could lead to market failure. That's definitely supported. So we're looking for the one that's least supported. Let's look at A versus C. Healthcare subsidization is a necessary function of the government to maintain high social benefits. Again, that's not really the point of the passage, as much as it is, taking into consideration these variables. So A is gone. C seems very weak in terms of it being least supported. And then negative externalities take into consideration third parties not involved in the initial. Yeah, that's exactly what they do, and that has a lot of proof. So I'd say C is the right answer here. Last question. What was the most likely reason that the author used the example of the discomfort of the neighboring passengers? And remember that was in paragraph 1, paragraph 1. And so neighboring passengers, so for example, so this is going to be supporting this claim over here, which is that there's an issue that arises when transaction between 2 parties has a consequence of a third party. So whatever that is, let's see, A versus B. So to illustrate the issue that arises when yeah, perfect. So I'll just go ahead and select that and be done with it. And yeah, cool. So I was about 30 seconds over time, obviously narrating it as I went and trying to be courteous to the listener is slowed me down a little bit. But as you can see, we're all done now. So let's go ahead and take a deep breath and slow down and see what the heck just happened. First of all, answers right here: B, C, A, C, A, B, C, A, C, A. Excellent. The process that I'm using here again, initially what needs to happen is, whether or not we have the full 10 minutes, we need to make sure that we understand the conclusion that the author's making, because every single passage on the MCAT has a point. There's no passage on the MCAT that doesn't have a point. And so the concern is, well, how do I know what the point of the passage is? Now, generally speaking, the point of the passage is going to be in the conclusion, right? This is the part of every essay that the author or speaker, think about yourself, whenever you've been taught on how to write essays, you've always been taught that in the conclusion you're supposed to sort of restate the main point that you want the readers to be left with, right? What do you want the reader to sort of take away from reading this article here, or this essay? And so again, the main conclusions, the main sort of thesis of the essay is very, very often found in the conclusion, and even and also quite often found in the last sentence of the entire essay. And so I actually like to start there, right? And the reason being, it's sort of like Imagine that you were my Uber driver, and I hop into your car, and you're driving along, and you're like, okay, so where do you want to go? And I'm like, oh yeah, just keep driving. And so at every single turn, you're like, should I go here? Should I go here? Should I go here? Should I go here? Right? You have no idea. You're full of anxiety the entire time that we're driving until I say, yep, okay, we're here. That's terrible, because like you're so slow. You're picking up every single detail, every single thing you're asking, every little detail, every little street sign. You have no idea where you're going. And so you don't know what details are relevant. As opposed to that, what you want to do, or what I like to do, is I like to know, where am I heading first? What is the point that I'm trying to get to first? And that way, as I'm reading the passage, I know what points to turn at and to pay attention to. I know what details are relevant. Boom, 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 and boom. Right? So much less anxiety. You know, I pay attention way less to the irrelevant details and the examples and the sort of fluff, as opposed to in the first situation, which is the majority of how students read, which is specifically from top down instead of knowing what is the point of the passage in the first place. What I like to equate that to is, imagine that you had a spoiler, right, for a movie. So you knew the ending of a movie up front. Well, not only has the movie been spoiled for you, meaning that you know, oh yeah, you know exactly where this is headed, right? But the cool thing is that you're actually engaged more throughout the movie, because you want to know, how on earth does it end up here? Like, you want to look at all the pieces that might be relevant that would lead you to that conclusion, right? So that's why with a lot of great thriller movies or suspenseful movies, oftentimes you have to watch it again, because it's like, oh, now that you know where you ended up, you want to know what were all those details that you missed out on along the way. So it's the same thing with reading a passage. For me, I want to know, where am I heading first, so that when I'm reading it, I know what details to look out for that stand out, so that I know that I'm not wasting my time and I'm not overburdening myself with excess details. I'm only looking for the details that really connect with the main point of the passage. And so that's what I do first, is to look at the concluding sentence and start to predict what the point of the passage is. Now, generally speaking, if you noticed, what I did was there was no title here. If there was a title, I would have read that first. But there was no title, so what I did was I just kind of spent 5 seconds glancing at the first sort of topic sentence from each of the paragraphs, kind of looking for buzzwords. And so I saw, regulation, taxation, transaction, externalities, subsidizing, right? So production, you kind of understand that it's more of an economics passage. And that's all I needed to know. Why? Because on the MCAT you have 2 types of passages, right? The 2 types of passage you have, and again, for inside the program, you have the breakdown in the PDF of exactly what the different types of passages are, what the different types of problems are. So you'll notice that this type of passage is what? If it's economics, it would fall under the social sciences passage type, right? And you know that. So with regards to social science passages, what do we know that's true about those types of passages, right? What we know is that they're more descriptive, and they're not necessarily saying that that one thing is more important than another. They're just saying that something is important. They'll say, like, don't forget. This is also important. That's what a lot of these social sciences are trying to say. They're saying, hey, this is important. It's not saying that something else is not important or better or worse or whatever, but hey, this is important. So what is it that's so important that this author is trying to tell you? What are they describing to you? And also remember that they often portray a relationship between an X and a Y variable. Because remember, in any science, in any hard science, you have X to Y relationships. That's the whole sort of scientific method. It's very similar in social sciences, is that they're trying to show you the connection between certain inputs and certain outputs. And so what I like to do is that because I knew what type of passage this was, when I'm reading this concluding sentence, I'm looking for what is that X to Y? What is that relationship that is so important for the author to describe? And the way that I formatted it was that these external variables are the X and the Y is the market viability, right? So whether or not certain variables are, taken into consideration, that's going to determine the market viability of a venture. And so already from the first sentence that I read, I understand the point of the passage. I understand the direction that the author is trying to take this passage in. So now when I read from top to bottom, what I'm looking for is, obviously, how does the author get there, right? How does the author come to that conclusion where they say that these external variables are so, doggone important, right, for the determination of whether a market venture is viable? So my questions are, well, first of all, what the heck are external variables? What are those variables? And why are they so crucial? And so now that I have asked myself those questions, that makes the whole passage so much easier, because now I know what to look out for, right? I know what details are important and what details are not important. How do I know? Because the important details are the details that answer my questions. So I have two questions. What are the external variables? And why are they so important to consider in this determination of market viability? Those are my two questions. So compare that to maybe how you used to do passages. There's two types of readers, right? As you should know again from the PDF. But there's two types of readers. You have active readers and you have passive readers. Now, passive readers active readers are actively looking for things in the passage. Passive readers don't know what they're looking for, right? So who do you want to be? Do you want to be an active reader or a passive reader? Right? You want to be an active reader. And so you want to be actively looking for things in the passage. It's more efficient, and again, less anxiety, and you know exactly what details are relevant to construct the argument that the author has presented to you as it relates to the overall point of the passage. And so that's why first is I try to understand what is that point, what is that end of the road, and then I ask myself a couple questions of, okay, well, how does the author end up there, right? So before I did that, so step one is again sort of looking at what's the overall type of passage here. We said it's a social science passage, so that told me I'm going to be looking for something descriptive, something that says, okay, X relates to Y, and that something's important. Step two, reading the concluding sentence here, right? Which started with "in any case." And then I use that concluding sentence to see, okay, well, what is this X to Y component? What is so important that the author's trying to get across? That's step number two. Now, step number four is what I told you, where I pause and I ask myself a couple questions to sort of see, okay, what kind of questions am I looking for here? What kind of details am I looking for in the passage? So step three, in the middle of step two and four, step three, if you noticed, what I did was I made the quick layout. I made a quick prediction of the layout of the passage. Why did I do this? Again, it helps me in the future if ever I needed to have like a question that says, like this: what was the most likely reason that the author used the example of the discomfort of neighboring passengers? All of these types of questions that ask you for specific details of the passage, it's like, how are you supposed to remember all that, right? How do you know where it is in the passage? So for me, I often like to have this brief layout because it helps me remember at a high level the layout of the passage. So if it's asking me about the example of the neighboring passengers on the bus, I remember that, hey, is that before the first shift in tone or after? Was that in the context or was that in the conclusion? And I remembered it was in the context, so I knew it was somewhere in the first paragraph, because the first shift in tone was basically in the first paragraph. So why does this work? Again, if you remember from the PDF about the general strategy for CARS passages, you should remember that most CARS passages look like this, right? Step one, or the first part of the passage, is always the context. Then you have your first shift in tone, FSIT. Then immediately after the first shift in tone, the author gives you the main thesis, or at least a bit of a component of the main thesis. Then the majority of the rest of the passage is going to be proof, right, for that main thesis. And then the last paragraph is always the conclusion, which again restates main thesis. So as you can see, I like to frame the layout in terms of wherever the first shift in tone is, everything before is context, immediately after is the main thesis, after that and before the conclusion is the proof, and then the last paragraph is the conclusion. This is almost always how passages look, right? Especially when it comes to social science passages that are maybe a little bit more descriptive. But in any case, this is a very helpful framework. So that's step 3. So again, step 1, as you see in the strategy cheat sheets, step 1, you have trying to determine what type of passage it is. Step 2, reading the concluding sentence and the conclusion paragraph to extract the point of the passage. Step 3 is making a layout and trying to predict where you think the first shift in tone is. And how I did that is by looking at the topic sentences for each of the preceding paragraphs, just to see if there's any sort of phrases that might indicate to me off just really quickly if this is where the shift happens. Over here we have, commonly discussed, so that sounds like some context. Over here we have often debated, again that sounds like more context. Over here we have, just a more description. So I thought that this whole thing was contextual, right? This is context, this is context, and this is context. I thought that the whole thing is context, so I'm like, maybe it's just like the first shift in tone is somewhere in the 4th paragraph. But then as soon as I got to the top, I realized that, oh wait, the first shift in tone is in the first couple of sentences. In any case, so once I corrected that, then that means that the first paragraph, which is where the first shift in tone is, that's really what the context is about. Everything else is support, and then this is obviously the conclusion. So once I kind of predicted where the first shift in tone would be, even though I was wrong, I came to the top and I paused for a little bit, and I reminded myself, okay, what's the point? What's the point of the passage? And what are my couple of questions that I'm looking for? All right. Then I went ahead and read from top down to A, validate my prediction of where the first shift in tone is, and B, validate my prediction of what the thesis is, right? And then of course find the answers to my questions. So that makes me a very, very active reader, right? Again, so I am actively trying to validate my prediction of where the first shift in tone is. I'm actively trying to validate my understanding of what the conclusion or what the main conclusion of the passage is. And I'm actively trying to look for the answers to my 2 questions about what I thought the main idea was, namely, what are external variables and why are they so integral for determining the market viability of a venture. So if you notice the way that I read, it's bottom up, pause, and then top down. That's basically how I read, is like that. Boom, boom. So this sort of approach, again, it's very consistent in terms of applying it across every passage that I come across. It's helpful for me to handle strange passages, because if I start from the bottom, from the conclusion, I'm no longer freaking out along the way as I would be if I started from the top, especially when it comes to dense passages, you know, stuff like this, which talk about negative externalities. Like if you don't know what an externality is, then you'd feel lost. You'd feel like, what am I reading right now? But if you just stick to the sort of format of understanding that, okay, this usually the point of the passage is at the end here, then that really gives you a way to, you know, ground yourself into, okay, I guess that's the point of the passage. So overall, that's sort of the approach. And when I was highlighting, what I'm highlighting for is just any sort of phrase that either shows me cause and effect, so could lead to, right? That's sort of like a, you know, X could lead to Y phrase. Or I'm highlighting shifts in tone, right? Like but, or on the surface, an issue, right? Or yet, or but, or things like that, right? That's the second thing I'm highlighting. The third thing I'm highlighting has to do with emphasis words, right? Emphasis words. So, you know, failure is obviously a really powerful word. Especially is a very powerful word, right? The fourth sort of word that I'm trying to highlight for are conclusive words. So therefore, right? Therefore, that's a very, very good sort of conclusive word that I like to highlight for. And lastly, I like to highlight for definitive words. So things like are, right? You know, these are things that are, you know, is. These are things that the author is claiming as factual, so that must mean that's a really important part of their argument. And if you can find it, if the author ever uses we or I or our, that sort of first person type of a vocabulary, that's also kind of some points I'd like to highlight. Now, the highlighting doesn't really help me after the fact as much as it does help me as I'm reading. So it helps me emphasize these trigger words. Does that make sense? So when I'm reading, I want to make sure that I'm reading effectively. And so by highlighting certain things, I'm actually forcing myself to make a note of it. On the surface, right, that's how my brain reads that phrase, because I've trained myself with these few different types of phrases that, oh, this is an important phrase, because on the surface is sort of setting you up for a big shift in tone, right? Like, yeah, on the surface, you know, people think this and this and this is only meant to involve these two parties. But an issue arises when it has consequences in a third party, right? So this phrase, like on the surface, that sets you up for a shift in tone over here. So I highlight it so that my brain emphasizes it as I'm reading it, which is a really important skill to learn, is what specific words to highlight, again, just to help you read it better. Not the highlighting doesn't really help you after the fact, but it just helps you emphasize as you're reading along the way. So on the surface, blah 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 blah, an issue arises when blah blah blah. For example, and then they go into the example, and then more context, and you know, another benefit of this layout here, right, is that it helps me, again, filter what's important from what's not important. So if something is giving me an example, I don't need to spend my time and energy memorizing the example, because if the problem, like it did over here, if this problem asks me to refer back to that example, and usually it's about asking me what was the reason that that example was used, I don't need to memorize the details. But most people do memorize those details, and it's completely a waste of time. So what I do is I don't really emphasize it. I just kind of say, okay, well, whatever, you know, I read through it, but I don't necessarily highlight anything, as you can see, or try to keep anything in my mind. I just know that that example is somewhere in the first paragraph, and if I need to deal with it later on, I know how to deal with it. And then I read some more things, again, more examples, and then some buzzwords. So could lead to, therefore, but, right? I start to highlight those. And then some more examples, commonly discussed, again, that's sort of setting me up for a shift in tone, which it does over here. So anytime there's like a on the surface or things that are commonly discussed or the common belief or the standard story, those phrases are always setups for shift in tone, right? Like most people think, or most people talk about, It's like, well, what do you talk about, author? Like, what is it that you, what's your opinion? So that's usually a setup for these shifts in tones. So, I don't really spend much time and energy paying attention to this stuff, paying attention to this stuff, paying attention to this stuff, paying attention to this stuff. It's only really, those are just sort of the fluff in between the big emphasis words and the shifts in tones and the causal words and the first person words and the emphasis words, right? And those are the claims and those are the sentences that I really try to make a note of and highlight. So yet, there are unintended consequences of economic actions, right? This and this. So especially if it's not calculated to include all appropriate values, and then so on and so forth. So overall, what would be on my scratch paper would essentially be just this brief sort of layout. And I would also, on my scratch paper, if I needed to, I would have written down basically what the main point of the argument is, or the passages. So I'd write down something like this, and that's about it. I'm not really taking that many notes, again, if I can handle it. But if you need to, take notes. But as you start to get more comfortable with this, you will be able to hold, that one or two sentence in your head. But feel free to write out the main idea on the notes. And again, we go over some note-taking strategies, exercises, and drills in the other parts of this course. If you want to check that out in more detail, you have highlighting drills, note-taking drills, argument synthesis drills. But for the purposes of this explanation, just sort of following along with it, well, it will suffice. So that's what I did in this situation. I knew that it was an economics passage, so I knew it was more causal and descriptive. Then I read the concluding sentence, found those main variables here, X and Y. Then I tried to guess where the first shift in tone was. So I guessed that it was in paragraph 4. Then I came to the top and I paused and I asked myself, okay, what was the main thesis again? Oh yeah. And what are my questions that I'm looking for? Oh yeah. And then once I got that again, I read from top to bottom, highlighting some of those important phrases. And then as soon as I got to the concluding sentence, I stopped because I had read that already and I was good to go. So that's my sort of passage approach. And again, usually it takes under 5 minutes for me to do that. But if you have 10 minutes per passage, you can take about 5.5 minutes altogether. For speed reading, what I tend to do is I tend to read from bottom up. So I'll do that part of the process. I will pause, and then I'll read only until I validate where that first shift in tone is, because right after the first shift in tone is the main thesis, right? So that helps me validate my prediction of the main thesis from the conclusion. And if those two things are in synchronicity, I stop reading all of this stuff. So basically, in this situation, if I had like 2 minutes to read, I would spend, about a minute reading the conclusion, about 10 seconds predicting the layout, about 30 seconds to a minute reading from top down to find the first shift in tone. And as soon as I found the first shift in tone, I would stop, and I would probably skip literally all of these middle 3 paragraphs because I had validated that the conclusion and the first shift in tone connect with my prediction of the main thesis, and that's good enough, right? That's good enough, especially if I have like only 2 minutes or 4 minutes or 5 minutes or something like that total. Then you need to kind of find the main thesis quickly and then do your best with the problems later on. So if I have the full 10 minutes, I'm reading from the full process. If I have only a couple minutes left, then I'll do that abridged version. And again, we have some speed reading strategies as well later on in the course. So that should basically cover the passage interpretation, what I highlighted for, why I highlighted them, what my process was, and exactly what the main idea was from the passage. So the passage main idea was not about solutions to negative externalities. It was not about taxation. It was not about government regulation. It was not about subsidizing healthcare and public transportation. It was not about promoting behavior. It was not about that at all. The main point that the author's trying to make is, hey, don't forget, right? Don't forget, take into consideration external variables is important for the determination of market viability. Okay? And all of these strategies and processes and tools will help you kind of be confident in your understanding of the main idea, because you know that that's how passages are usually written. You know that those are the trigger words and phrases that emphasize what the main points that the author's trying to make are, and you know that that's sort of the way that social sciences passages tend to be. So with all of those components, you can be confident, and especially the biggest reason why you can be validated and confident in your prediction of the main thesis is because if your understanding of the conclusion, the prediction that you have from the conclusion, and what you determine from the first shift in tone in the main thesis in the beginning of the passage, if those two things do connect and they are in synchronicity, then you really should feel very confident that you understand, okay, that is really the point that the author is trying to make. It's the combination of these two things here. And with that information, you can begin to answer the first problem. Okay? And that is how you solve these types of problems. If any type of problem that you have which says main conclusion of the passage, that comes from one of the three categories of AAMC practice or passage problems, which, as you know from my the ebook that I wrote, you should know that those three problem types are the fundamentals of comprehension, foundations of comprehension, I should say, reasoning within the text, and reasoning beyond the text. Foundations of comprehension being, you know, things like, hey, did you just understand the argument? Did you know what the conclusion was? Did you comprehend what the passage was about? That's these types of problems. Reasoning within the text is like, hey, can you scrutinize the author's argument? How good are you at understanding why the author used this phrase or this example? That's those. Then reasoning beyond the text is like saying, hey, suppose some new situation occurred, how would the author respond? Or suppose some new information was found true, how would that affect the author's argument? That's those types of problems. So altogether, these are the types of problems that the MCAT's going to ask you: foundations of comprehension, reasoning within the text, and reasoning beyond the text. So in terms of that, this one is definitely foundations of comprehension. Which of the following claims would be best improved by the use of additional support? Again, that's, you know, being best improved. That's sort of being able to understand within the text. Can you improve? How would you improve the author's argument? That's reasoning within the text. What is the attitude of the author? That's definitely foundations of comprehension. Did you pretty much get what the point was in the first place? Which is least supported by the passage? Which is least supported by the passage? Those are usually going to be, I would say, beyond the text, because they're introducing, you know, new claims somewhere in here, and you have to reason, say, hey, was that actually there? But you could say that that's reasoning within the text as well, depending upon its format. The last problem here: what was the most likely reason that the author used this example? Again, that's reasoning within the text. So all of these different types and categories of problems have their own specific problem-solving processes that I want to sort of detail and slowly talk about now in terms of my approach. So when you're doing this type of problem with main conclusion, again, what you're trying to do is you're trying to make sure that you understand what that main thesis was from the first shift in tone, and what that was from that conclusion paragraph. The combination of this and this is all you need in order to determine the best answer. So once you know what those two things are, you take that knowledge, and what you do is you bracket the answers. So most people do process of elimination incorrectly. Most people, they'll say, okay, they'll look at an answer and they'll say, oh, that sounds pretty weak, let me cross it out. Oh, that sounds pretty weak, let me cross it out. Oh, that sounds pretty weak, let me cross it out. Oh, that sounds pretty weak, let me cross it out. And by the time they're done with it, they're like, wait a minute, I've crossed out all four answers. I have to uncross out an answer now, so let me uncross out B. Let me uncross out D. Which one's better? Right? It's this very sort of unmethodological, sort of flimsy process that doesn't really make sense. The way that I like to do process elimination is what I call bracketing. It's like a college basketball tournament. You put one team up against another, and then you determine the strongest team of that bracket. That's it. You don't You don't move. You don't just like eliminate the first team, eliminate the second team. You have to have one versus another. So if one answer choice is really, really weak and is very weak and much weaker than the other answer choice, then you can cross off that weakest answer choice, because then you know that it will never be that answer choice, because there will always be at least another answer choice stronger than it. So you only want to make sure you're crossing off answer choices that you know are very, very weak, especially if they are weaker than something else. That's how you can conclusively know what answer choice to cross off. That will greatly improve your speed when you're determining answers, and that will greatly reduce the amount of times you have to second guess yourself. The criteria that I use to determine the strongest answer of a bracket is simply 4 letters. MSLR. That stands for most support, least rationalization. So again, which of these answer choices has the most clear support from the information in the passage, and which of these answer choices you have to kind of rationalize for. As soon as you read an answer choice and your brain goes like, what? Right? You have to sort of think and say, well, maybe this, or maybe that, maybe this. Stop right there. You are rationalizing. If you have another answer choice that's simpler, that's clearly supported from the passage, that's probably going to be it. So that would be the stronger answer of the bracket. So for example, if you just thought about the main conclusion of the passage being that you should take into consideration these external variables when determining the market viability of a venture, if that's your main thesis, that these variables are really important, and this first answer choice is talking about how taxation would not be a prudent solution, that should already give your brain like a bunch of question marks, like, wait a minute, how does this relate to the conclusion? It doesn't. It doesn't. But if you would have selected that answer, then you would have rationalized that, right? Of course, this part talks about externalities, but this part does not. So it's pretty weak. But let's look at B first. So B says the calculation of market viability should incorporate negative and positive externalities, right? So this talks about calculation of market viability, which is the determination of market viability of a venture. And this talks about how it should incorporate negative and positive externalities. Negative and positive externalities are external variables, if you didn't get that from the passage, right? So this checks off all the boxes. So it's definitely stronger than A. Maybe it's not the right answer, but it's definitely stronger than A. So we can cross off A pretty conclusively. So then we go B versus C. So C says production facilities that use unsustainable materials. As soon as you read that phrase, you should already feel those question marks, and you're like, wait a minute, that's not even close. So don't even finish reading that answer choice. Just cross it off, because B is already way more supported from the passage in terms of the main conclusion. So B versus D. D says subsidizing unintended social benefits is a lower risk option than regulating unintended social costs. And again, already you should feel a bit of question marks, because it's a little bit of a confusing answer choice there. And when it talks about subsidizing and lower risk options and regulations, remember, that's not what this passage is talking about. That's not the main conclusion, as much as it is incorporating these variables, these externalities, right? And you should feel that that's the case, because remember, with economics passages, generally speaking, they never say that this thing is more important than this thing. They usually have a balanced view of solutions. They'll say, well, this thing is good and it's also bad. What their main points are for these social science types of passages is they're just saying that something is important, not that something is more important. So D is kind of showing that sense of comparison, that like this is more important than this, whereas B is just sort of saying, hey, this is important. And so you should feel confident with these types of passages and these types of problems selecting B as the correct answer. With regards to the second type of problem, which of the following claims would be best improved, right? There's 3 types of answer choices that the MCAT can present to you in these types of problems, right? One of the answer choices is going to be a claim that was made with additional support. One was going to be a claim that was not made, and one's going to be a claim that was made with no additional support. So which of these 3 points is going to be the answer to these types of problems? Which of the following claims would be best improved by the use of additional support? Well, first of all, it has to be a claim. So it can't be a claim that was not made. It has to have been a claim actually made in the passage for it to make sense as the answer. And second, if we have to improve it with additional support, then it has to be the one that has no additional support. It can't be the one that has additional support already. So we're looking for a claim that was made in the passage, but that didn't have any additional support. So when you go through and you bracket it, you'll realize that subsidizing state healthcare, public transportation, or investment in education technology are all ways to promote behavior of private parties to incorporate social costs and benefits into actions. Nowhere else in the passage was it talking about this point as much as it was the other points. And so therefore C is the strongest answer there. With regards to number 3, these types of problems of attitude, again, usually with these economic social science types of passages, you're going to have more of a neutral tone. But just so that we're clear, you know, the problem is if the problem was saying what's the attitude of the author towards utilization of external variables, well, then it would have been supportive, right? That's exactly the point. But in these situations, what's the tone toward government regulation? It's not the point of the passage, and so therefore it's not supporting, it's not antagonizing. It's going to be more neutral and sort of saying, hey, these are the pros and cons, so more cautious. Which of the following claims is least supported by the passage? So in these situations, you have only 2 options. A claim that was made, or a claim that was not made. Those are your only 2 options. And so you just go A versus B, you kind of go one by one, see which of these is a claim that was very much not made, that was like not made at all, you know? And then you'll see that healthcare subsidization is a necessary function of the government. That has the least support at all, as compared to the other ones, if you were to bracket them. And finally, we have number 5 here. What was the most likely reason that the author used the example of the discomfort of the neighboring passengers? So with regards to these types of problems where they ask you what was the reason why such and such used this example, it's a very straightforward formula for solving these problems. And if you remember this formula, you'll be able to solve every single type of problem like this in the future. Step 1, locate the paragraph that this example was in. And we use our understanding of the layout to remember, was this in the context? Like, was it before the first shift in tone? Was it right after? And we remember that it was literally right after in the first paragraph. So we located it. Excellent. So we locate the beginning of this example. The second step is to look at the context clues. Look at the sentence or the claims made immediately prior to that example. And the claim that's made is saying that an issue arises when the transaction between 2 parties has consequences on a third party. So that's the claim being made, is that there's an issue when a transaction has consequences on a third party. So the reason why the author used this example is almost always to support whatever claim is made here. So that's the answer, that the author uses this example to support whatever claim is made just before it. So you have to find exactly that. So this says to illustrate the issue that arises when transaction between 2 parties has consequences on a third party. That's exactly why the author uses this thing. So if you look at the other answer choices, it says to present a case for the necessity for increased government regulation on small businesses. That's definitely gives you a lot of question marks. So I mean, I'm totally rationalizing that. So B is pretty weak. A versus C, to describe an anecdotal experience encountering negative externalities. Not bad. The issue here is the word anecdotal. And anecdotal, usually in the context of the MCAT, is going to mean a personal experience. Now, we have no way of knowing if this was a personal experience of the author. So this is weaker than A. And D says to demonstrate the need for parties involved in voluntary transactions to consider how their affections affect others around them. Now, this is also a clever answer choice. It says to demonstrate the need for parties involved in voluntary transactions to consider how they affect others around them. That might be the case for how you feel when you read it, like how if you felt that need when you read the passage, that's one thing. But in terms of what was the most likely reason, we have to know, we have to have specific proof from the passage. So just because you might have felt that oh wow, maybe I should consider how my actions affect others around me, just because you felt that doesn't mean that's the most likely reason why the author used the example. The most likely reason, the one that we have the most support for, is very simply to illustrate or support the claim made in the previous sentence. So one thing that you want to consider is that when it comes to the MCAT, there is always a clear right answer. There's never any ambiguity. You must understand that. Why? Very simply, the AAMC and the MCAT, it's a standardized exam. Standardized. That means that all of the medical schools that are making their decisions of who to accept into their schools are hiring the AAMC to give them a standardized, consistent estimate of people's ability. You cannot have something standardized and ambiguous at the same time. It doesn't work. Standardized means it has to be clear. Very, very clear. So when you're considering the exam, you must understand that AMC material and that those material have clear right answers, that there's a clear logic and a clear reasoning as to why one answer is better than another. And if you've experienced other test prep companies' passages that were very ambiguous, that's because they're not necessarily standardizing themselves or holding themselves up to the standard that the AAMC does. And so these passages that I use, that I created, I literally had deconstructed the AAMC guidelines and I followed them word by word, so that, very strictly, so that this standardization approach was actually included. And over the course of this this program, you're going to start to know and learn yourself what that deconstruction looked like, what those guidelines are, what those rules are. Because if you knew how the AAMC wrote the exam, that would be helpful, right? You would know exactly what to look for. That over the course of all these passages that I'm going to break down for you, it's going to start to click and make sense. You're going to see the patterns over and over again. Okay? So stick with it. And if you have any sort of questions or anything like that, again, I do have the private Reddit community that you can post on. And so if you're a member of this program, you can join that Reddit community and screenshot or share some of this some of these problems or parts that you were a bit confused about or things like that. If you need some additional help, and the other students and myself will be able to chime in and sort of help clear things up for you. Okay, so again, I hope that was helpful. If you need anything else, please let me know. Make sure that you're doing the drills, you're doing the exercises, and that you're following along with the other video breakdowns as well. All right, keep going, stay motivated. You can do this, take your time, and I'll see you soon.